Welcome to the deep dive. We're your shortcut to understanding the really complex, sometimes, yeah, frankly, terrifying world of digital security today.
hmm
And our mission today is pretty critical. We're going beyond just the theory, the perfect math that supposedly protects everything online.
Right.
We're diving headfirst into the messy reality of how these systems actually get broken.
Yeah.
Practical exploitation.
Yeah, it's that clash, isn't it? The elegant mathematics versus, well, imperfect code written by humans.
Exactly. It's like theory versus physics almost.
It really is. In theory, cryptography is this amazing shield. And some experts, they genuinely believe the focus should just be on perfecting the math, finding that unbreakable algorithm.
But that's not where the action is usually.
Well, not when you look at actual breaches, no.
Yeah.
When you see how systems fail in the real world, that pure math focus, it kind of falls apart. The uncomfortable truth is most of the big security problems we see, they're down to bad software.
Flaws in how it's built, not the underlying crypto itself.
Precisely. Implementation errors, design oversights, not usually the cipher.
And that distinction is just, it's everything, isn't it? Especially for you listening, because you need solid knowledge without getting totally swamped in details. We have to bring these two worlds together, understand how strong that math bedrock really is, why we trust it, but then immediately look at how the whole thing can crumble because of one careless mistake in the code.
It comes down to your threat model, always. Security is relative.
Right, there's no such thing as absolute security.
Absolutely not. It's all about who you're trying to protect against.
Yeah.
If it's just some random script kiddie, okay, your defenses might look one way.
But if it's a nation state
With huge
resources,
then it becomes existential. Totally different ballgame. The math, it buys you time, definitely. But it's the code, the implementation, that decides if you actually get to use that time effectively.
Okay, let's start with that mathematical bedrock then. Public key cryptography. This is the magic behind secure websites, encrypted emails, digital signatures, everything where we need trust without, meeting face to face.
And it hinges on these things called one-way functions.
Easy one way, incredibly hard the other.
Exactly. Easy to compute, but reversing it. That's designed to be computationally infeasible, or at least just wildly impractical with current technology.
And that difficulty, that's where the security comes from?
That's the source, yes. And today, we mostly rely on two big mathematical pillars for this. The first, the classic one, is RSA.
Named after Rivest Shamir Adelman.
That's the one. RSA's security is tied directly to how hard it is to factor very large numbers.
So the idea is you pick two massive prime numbers, P and Q, multiply them, you get N.
Right, and N is public. Anyone can see it.
But getting P and Q back just from N, that's the hard part.
That's the computationally expensive part, yeah. Multiplying them is trivial, even for huge numbers. But factoring N back into P and Q, we don't have an efficient classical algorithm for that if N is big enough.
And crucially, getting the private key in RSA is basically the same difficulty as factoring N.
They're considered computationally equivalent problems, yes. If someone found a fast way to factor N, RSA would essentially break overnight.
Poof. And the size of N is what protects us, but those estimates for how long it protects us, they seem to change all the time.
Oh, absolutely. It's kind of an arms race. The scale is, it's hard to grasp. When RSA was new, people estimated factoring, say, a 130-digit number that's $10 other might take 50 years on one powerful machine back then.
Okay, 50 years sounds pretty safe.
It did. But then you factor in, forgive the pun, the real-world threat. Imagine a coordinated effort, like a state-level actor using, say, 100 million captured PCs in a botnet.
Suddenly 50 years shrinks.
Dramatically. That same 10 number, it could potentially be factored in maybe 15 seconds.
15 seconds. Wow. That completely changes the game for anyone trying to keep secrets long term.
It forces constant escalation to get real security, like decades worth, against a major adversary. The current thinking is N needs to be enormous, at least $10.
A number with over 300 digits?
Yeah. Something so big that even with that hypothetical 100 million PCs grinding away, it would still take, potentially thousands of years. But we're always just one breakthrough away, theoretically.
And that pressure, the need for bigger and bigger keys, that's partly what led to elliptic curve cryptography, ECC.
Exactly. ECC came along, proposed back in '85 by Koblitz and Miller independently. It was clever because it didn't invent totally new algorithms. It took existing schemes, like Diffie-Hellman for key exchange, and just implemented them using the mathematics of elliptic curves.
And the big advantage?
Efficiency. ECC gives you roughly the same level of security as RSA, but with much, much smaller key sizes. That's huge for things like mobile phones, embedded devices, anywhere computing power or bandwidth is limited.
Okay, and ECC relies on a different hard math problem, right? Not factoring.
Correct. It's based on the discrete logarithm problem, or DLP, specifically on elliptic curves. And there's a related problem, the computational Diffie-Hellman problem, CDH.
Why the two different names, DLP and CDH?
Think of it like a hierarchy of difficulty. DLP, the discrete logarithm problem, is generally considered the harder one. It's about finding the secret exponent used to generate a public key.
Like finding the secret recipe ingredient.
Sort of, yeah. CDH, the computational Diffie-Hellman problem, is a bit more specific, calculating a shared secret value given some public information derived from that secret.
Okay.
The key thing is, if you can solve the DLP for a given curve, you can definitely solve the related CDH problem. So DLP is at least as hard as CDH.
But solving CDH doesn't necessarily mean you can solve DLP.
Not necessarily, no. It's similar to the relationship between factoring n and breaking RSA itself. They're linked, but one might be slightly easier. But for practical purposes, if the curve is chosen well, both are considered extremely hard for classical computers. That's the foundation.
Okay, so that's the asymmetric stuff, RSA, ECC. Slow, but essential for setting things up, like exchanging keys.
Right.
But for encrypting the actual bulk data, like a large file or a streaming video, we use symmetric ciphers. Faster stuff, like DES or IDEA historically, now AES.
The workhorses, yeah.
Once we've used RSA or ECC to securely agree on a shared secret key, how do we make sure these symmetric ciphers are strong enough, especially against those big adversaries?
Well, with symmetric block ciphers, security isn't about a hard math problem like factoring. It's much more about the key length and the internal design of the cipher, how well it mixes things up, diffusion and confusion.
And this is where older algorithms run into trouble, like DES, the data encryption standard.
DES is the classic example, yeah. The consensus for a long time now is that basic DES with its 56-bit key is just not secure against any serious adversary.
Why? Key too small?
Simply too small. The cost and feasibility of building specialized hardware, or just renting cloud computing power, to brute force a 56-bit key.
Yeah.
It's well within reach for governments, large corporations, even motivated criminal groups now.
So unless you're using it for something incredibly short-lived with a throwaway key.
Right. Otherwise, it's considered broken for general use.
So for years, if you needed strong long-term security with DES, what was the fix?
The standard recommendation was triple DES or 3 DES. You basically run the DES algorithm 3 times with 2 or ideally 3 independent keys. That effectively increases the key length and makes brute force much, much harder.
Okay, and how did something like IDEA compare? International Data Encryption Algorithm.
IDEA was designed later and had a 128-bit key, more than double DES's 56 bits. That immediately made it significantly more resistant to brute force attacks.
Now, even with stronger keys, there's this theoretical attack called meet in the middle that can sometimes break double encryption schemes faster than brute force. Did that affect IDEA?
Ah, yes. Meet in the middle. A very clever attack. But IDEA's key size makes it practically useless.
So.
The meet in the middle attack works by essentially encrypting from one end with all possible keys, decrypting from the other end with all possible keys, storing all the intermediate results, and looking for a match in the middle.
Sounds computationally intensive.
It is, but the real killer is the memory requirement. To store all those intermediate values for, say, a hypothetical double IDEA, which wouldn't make sense, but theoretically, you'd need something on the order of 10 ducks of storage.
10 bytes. Isn't that like more atoms than there are in the known universe territory?
Pretty much, yeah. The estimates vary, but it's astronomically physically impossible amount of storage. So while the attack exists in theory, IDEA's key length pushes the resource requirements into pure science fiction. It's a defense based on sheer impossible scale.
It really highlights that time-memory trade-off in attacks.
Exactly. That's a fundamental concept. Let's take double DES, which has an effective key length of 112 bits, $2 times $506.
Okay.
A naive brute force search would take about 212 operations, which is huge, but requires very little memory.
Right.
The classic meet-in-the-middle attack reduces the time needed down to roughly 250 60s, much more feasible. But the cost is you need about 256 of memory to store those intermediate values.
So you trade time for space.
You trade time for space. And what's neat is that you can often adjust the trade-off. There are variations where the product of time and memory stays roughly constant, around $212 for double DES. So an attacker could choose, say, 202 pounds and 200 space, or 240 time and 200 space, depending on whether they have more computing power or more storage available. They optimize based on their resources.
Okay, so the basic crypto math, if you use long enough keys and modern algorithms like AES or ECC, seems pretty solid against classical computers for now.
For now, yes, the algorithms themselves are generally sound.
But then we hear about these attacks that supposedly break ciphers. This brings us to certificational attacks. What are those? They sound bad, but you mentioned they often have no real-world impact.
Right. These are attacks that are very important academically and for the long-term evolution of cryptography, but they don't usually represent an immediate practical threat to deployed systems. The classic examples are the attacks on DES back in the 90s.
Differential and linear cryptanalysis.
Exactly. Differential cryptanalysis was the first big one. It showed you could theoretically break DES faster than brute force, but it required something like 2 chosen plaintexts.
Chosen plaintext meaning the attacker gets to pick what messages get encrypted.
Yes, they feed specific inputs into the encryption machine and observe the outputs. Then linear cryptanalysis came along, slightly more efficient, needing only 2-3 known plaintexts.
Known, meaning they just need pairs of plaintext and corresponding ciphertext they've observed.
Correct. Now, scientifically, these were breakthroughs. They revealed subtle mathematical weaknesses in DES's design. They absolutely affected its security certification.
But practically, did systems using DES suddenly become insecure?
No, not at all. Because think about the requirements. Finding a real-world scenario where an attacker can get 243 three-kind texts, let alone 2 3-chosen plaintexts, all encrypted with the same key. It just doesn't happen.
The operational context makes the attack impossible.
Utterly impossible from an engineering perspective in any standard protocol. So while these attacks were crucial for learning how not to design future ciphers, like AES, they had zero practical impact on the security of existing DES deployments at the time. The weakness was purely theoretical in that context.
That's a really important distinction. Helps filter the hype when you hear cipher broken.
Definitely. You always have to ask, what are the attack requirements? Is it actually feasible?
Okay, so let's assume we're using a strong cipher, strong keys. What about simpler attacks? Like, couldn't an attacker just record an encrypted message and send it again later? A replay attack.
Now you're hitting on protocol failures. That's not a break of the cryptography itself, but a flaw in how it's used in the communication sequence. And yes, replay attacks are a fundamental threat.
So how do protocols defend against that?
The core idea is to ensure freshness. You need a way to guarantee that the message you just received was created now for this specific session and isn't just an old recording. This is usually done using nonces.
Nonces, like number used once.
Exactly. Unique, often random, values generated for each session, or even each message exchange.
Can you walk through a simple example like Alice and Bob setting up a secure channel?
Sure. Let's say Alice and Bob have already used something like Diffie-Hellman to agree on a shared secret key. Okay, now they want to be sure they're talking to each other live. Alice might generate a random nonce, or dollars, and send it to Bob. Bob then generates his own random nonce, $3. He might encrypt $30 with the shared key K and send it back to Alice.
So Alice knows Bob has the key K if he can decrypt it, but how does Bob know Alice is live?
This is where the challenge response comes in. Alice decrypts $3. Now, instead of just sending $30 back, which could be a replay, she performs a simple, agreed-upon mathematical operation on it. A common one is just subtracting 1. She calculates $3 1.
Why -1? Seems arbitrary.
It's predictable, but it proves she processed the specific $3 Bob just sent. She encrypts this result, $3 1, using the key K and sends it back to Bob.
Okay. So Bob gets this message. He decrypts it. He checks if the result is indeed 1 less than the rebar he originally sent.
Exactly. If it matches, he knows 2 things. First, the sender has the correct key K because they decrypted $3 and encrypted $30 correctly. And second, they perform the operation on the fresh nonce he just sent. It proves liveness and prevents replay.
So all that fussing around with random numbers and simple math is purely about ensuring the messages are current and legitimate.
It's absolutely vital for protocol security.
Yeah.
Good crypto needs good protocol design around it.
Okay, this leads perfectly into the next big area. We've established the math, even with its theoretical limits, is incredibly strong if used right. The protocols handle things like replay. So where do things actually break down so often?
Implementation. It almost always comes back to the software implementation. the code.
The human element.
The human element, exactly. The security holes are rarely in the published, vetted cryptographic algorithms. They're in the mundane, everyday code that uses those algorithms. Flaws in program design, how it handles unexpected input, the environment it runs in.
It really is like having a bank vault door made of vibranium, but the walls are drywall.
That's a perfect analogy. Modern software is just so complex. Developers are the front line, and if they make a mistake, maybe misunderstand a security requirement, use an unsafe function, don't validate input properly, the whole system can be compromised no matter how strong the encryption is on the data itself.
And the classic, the poster child for these implementation flaws has to be buffer overflows.
Oh, absolutely. Buffer overflows. They've been around for decades, and they are still depressingly common.
So the basic idea, program expects, say, 20 bytes of data. Attacker sends 50. The extra 30 spill over and overwrite something important in memory.
That's the core concept. And where that something important lives matters, we generally talk about overflows on the stack versus overflows on the heap.
Right. Stack versus heap memory. Can you break that down?
Sure. So the stack is a region of memory used for managing function calls. It holds local variables for the function currently running, parameters passed into it, and critically, the return address.
The return address tells the program where to go back to after the function finishes executing.
Exactly. And that makes stack overflows often easier to exploit, relatively speaking. If your overflowing data can overwrite that return address, you can potentially redirect the program's execution flow to code you control. Maybe shellcode you injected as part of the overflow.
So you hijack the program's control flow directly.
Pretty much. Now, the heap is different. That's where memory is allocated more dynamically for things like larger data structures, objects, things whose size isn't known at compile time.
And overflowing a buffer on the heap. That sounds like it should work the same way, but you said it's often harder to exploit.
It is generally much harder, yeah. Exploiting heap overflows is often considered more of an art.
Why?
Several reasons. First, the layout of the heap is less predictable than the stack. Memory gets allocated and freed in complex patterns. An attacker needs to figure out not just how to overflow a buffer, but how to make that overflow overwrite something specific and useful, like a function pointer or a critical flag that might be located somewhere else entirely in memory.
You have to aim carefully.
Very carefully, and often blindly, without source code. Plus, modern operating systems and memory allocators have heap hardening techniques, things like guard pages, randomization, ASLR, metadata checks, specifically designed to make reliable heap exploitation much more difficult. You might crash the program, sure, but getting reliable code execution is tough.
Let's make this concrete with that classic C programming example, the dangerous function.
Ah, yes, the infamous strictpy.
String copy.
Right. Imagine a simple function, maybe called concatarguments, that takes command line input. The programmer allocates a fixed size buffer on the stack. Char input buffer 20, room for 20 bytes.
Okay. Seems reasonable.
But then, to copy the user-supplied argument, maybe argv1, into this buffer, they use strictpy, input buffer, argv1.
And there's the problem.
There's the ticking time bomb. Stricky has no idea that input buffer is only 20 bytes long. It just copies characters from argv1 until it hits a null byte, the end of string marker.
So if the user provides 50 characters in argv1,
those extra 30 characters just keep writing past the end of input buffer. They start stomping over whatever happens to be next on the stack. That could be other local variables, saved pointers, or the jackpot for an attacker, the function's save return address.
and boom, control potentially handed to the attacker.
Exactly. Just because the developer used a function that doesn't check boundaries. It's a fundamental error class that incredibly still persists in some legacy code bases.
Yeah.
Use Cranktome or other safer alternatives.
Okay, overflows are the classic, but there are more. Exotic ways software flaws can be exploited, right? Like format string attacks? That one sounds really weird.
It is weird and incredibly clever. Format string vulnerabilities turn standard output functions, like print and C, into tools for reading and writing arbitrary memory.
How does printing something let you write to memory?
It comes down to how printf and similar functions handle format specifiers. Those little codes like % for decimal, % for hex, % for string. They tell print what type of data to expect to find on the stack and how to display it.
Okay, standard stuff.
But the vulnerability happens when a developer lets user-controlled input become part of the format string itself. So instead of print user input.% user string, they mistakenly write print of user string.
Ah, so the user's input contains the format codes.
Exactly. And the attacker can then include malicious format specifiers. The most dangerous one is %.
What does % do?
Unlike other specifiers that read data from the stack, percent writes data. It takes the number of bytes successfully printed so far by that printf call and writes that number into a memory address that it expects to find also on the stack.
Whoa, okay. So if I can control the format string and I can control some value on the stack that print thinks is a pointer.
You can write an arbitrary value, the byte count, to an arbitrary location, the pointer address. An attacker crafts a format string with carefully placed percents and lots of padding characters, %100x, etc., to control the byte count precisely. They also arrange for the target memory address, like an entry in the global offset table or GOT, which holds addresses for library functions, to be on the stack where percent expects it.
And they can overwrite that GOT entry to point to their own malicious code.
Precisely. Then, the next time the program tries to call that library function, it gets redirected to the attacker's code. It's a way to hijack control flow without a traditional buffer overflow.
Yeah.
Super subtle, very powerful.
This complexity, the sheer variety of attack methods seems overwhelming. How do defenders even keep track? Is that where frameworks like IRE, ATT, and CK come in?
Yes, exactly. IRE, AT, and CK is essentially a structured knowledge base of adversary tactics and techniques based on real-world observations. It moves beyond just cataloging vulnerabilities like CVEs and focuses on the behavior of attackers.
TTP's tactics, techniques, and procedures.
Right. ATT and CK breaks down the entire life cycle of an attack, from initial access and execution to persistence, privilege escalation, lateral movement, collection, exfiltration, and impact. And for each tactic, it lists specific techniques attackers use.
Can you give an example of a simple TTP that isn't some complex exploit?
Sure. Under the tactic credential access, there's a technique T1552.003, bash history.
Just looking at the command history file.
Yeah. It describes the common attacker behavior of simply reading a user's .history file, or PowerShell history, etc., hoping to find passwords, API keys, or sensitive commands that were typed accidentally on the command line and saved.
That's not a zero-day exploit. That's just looking around.
Exactly. But it's a documented, known technique attackers use to get credentials. By having it cataloged in ATT and CK, defenders can think systematically. Okay, how do we mitigate the risk of technique T1552.003? We can enforce stricter permissions on history files, limit history size, educate users, maybe implement tools that scrub sensitive data from logs. It helps defenders build proactive defenses based on known adversary behaviors, not just reactively patch vulnerabilities.
Okay, let's scale this up. We've talked about buffer overflows, format strings, simple TTPs. What happens when these techniques are wielded by highly skilled, well-funded adversaries, like nation-states targeting critical infrastructure?
Then you get into the realm of advanced persistent threats, APTs, and potentially devastating real-world consequences. The textbook example, the one that really woke everyone up, is Stuxnet.
The malware aimed at Iran's nuclear program.
Specifically, their uranium enrichment centrifuges at Natanz. Stuxnet wasn't just code. It was arguably the first true cyber-physical weapon deployed at scale.
What made it so different?
Its sophistication and its goal. It used multiple zero-day exploits vulnerabilities unknown to Microsoft and Siemens at the time just to spread, even across air-gapped networks using infected USB drives. That alone was impressive.
But the payload was the really scary part.
The payload was terrifyingly precise. It targeted specific Siemens Step 7 industrial control system, ICS software running on the PLCs, programmable logic controllers, that managed the centrifuges. Once inside, the malicious code would subtly alter the commands sent to the centrifuges.
Making them spin too fast or too slow.
Both, in damaging sequences. It would cause them to spin erratically, far outside their safe operating parameters, leading to excessive wear and tear and ultimately physical destruction of these very expensive, critical machines.
They literally tore themselves apart.
Yes. And the absolute genius, the terrifying part was that while it was causing this physical damage, Stuxnet was simultaneously feeding false telemetry back to the engineer's monitoring screens. It recorded normal operating data and played it back in a loop.
So the operator saw everything looking fine, while the centrifuges were failing.
Exactly. Complete digital deception, masking, physical sabotage. It was a watershed moment. It proved cyber attacks could cause direct kinetic effects in the physical world.
And analysts eventually pieced it together partly because the attackers left behind some clues.
Yeah, somewhat ironically, the malware had some internal logging functions, probably for the attackers to track its own spread and effectiveness. But those logs became digital breadcrumbs that helped researchers map out its targets and understand its specific focus on netons.
Stuxnet proved cyber warfare wasn't just theoretical. Have we seen other attacks targeting critical systems since then? Maybe even safety systems?
Unfortunately, yes. We've seen groups like Sandworm, often attributed to Russia, targeting Ukrainian power grids and other infrastructure repeatedly. But perhaps the most chilling was the Triton, also called Trisis, malware discovered in 2017.
What did Triton Trisis target?
It specifically went after Safety Instrumented Systems, SIS, at an oil refinery in Saudi Arabia.
SIS. Those are the last line of defense, right? This is systems designed to shut everything down safely if the main controls fail, to prevent explosions or major accidents.
Precisely. They're the emergency brakes. Targeting the SIS means the attacker isn't just trying to disrupt operations, they are potentially trying to disable the safety mechanisms to cause a catastrophic failure. A deliberate attempt to cause physical harm, possibly loss of life.
That's a terrifying escalation.
It is. While the Triton attack ultimately just caused shutdowns because of bugs in the malware itself, its intent and capability showed that adversaries were actively developing and deploying tools aimed at defeating the most critical safety layers in industrial processes. The potential for disaster is enormous.
This really highlights the ongoing, often invisible cyber arms race happening between nations. We hear about the attacks that get discovered, but there must be a constant background hum of activity.
Oh, absolutely. It's a continuous clandestine conflict. And while many nations have offensive cyber capabilities, the consensus generally remains that the United States, primarily through the NSA, possesses the most sophisticated and deeply embedded capabilities.
The kind of capability needed for something like Stuxnet.
Exactly. Operations like that require deep expertise, multiple undiscovered vulnerabilities, intelligence gathering. It's a massive undertaking. Groups like the NSA's Tailored Access Operations, or TAO, are specifically tasked with this.
TAO's job is basically to break into foreign systems for intelligence purposes.
Their mission is to gain and maintain access to targeted systems worldwide. We know from leaks and disclosures that they've developed an extensive arsenal of exploits and implants, targeting a vast range of software and hardware. They invest heavily in finding vulnerabilities and weaponizing them into reliable operational tools.
So it's this constant hidden struggle. One side building defenses, the other constantly looking for cracks, developing digital keys.
It's a constant cat-and-mouse game, yes. And the existence of these powerful offensive capabilities held by states creates a complex and dangerous environment. The ability to achieve persistent, undetectable access is seen as a major strategic advantage.
Okay, so given this landscape, strong math undermined by weak code, sophisticated attackers exploiting those flaws, what can we actually do? If absolute security is impossible, how do we build systems that are at least resilient, dependable?
We have to shift the focus heavily towards secure design principles from the very beginning. Stop trying to bolt security on afterwards.
What are some key principles?
One powerful, though sometimes overlooked principle is immutability.
Designing data structures or objects so their state can't be changed after they're created.
Exactly. If an object is immutable, you inherently prevent a whole class of bugs related to unexpected state changes or illegal updates. It simplifies reasoning about the code.
How does that help security specifically?
Well, besides preventing state corruption bugs, immutable objects are naturally thread-safe. You can share them between different parts of a program running concurrently without needing complex locking mechanisms, which themselves can be sources of bugs and vulnerabilities like race conditions. It can also help against certain denial-of-service attacks by making data structures more robust.
Makes sense. What's another core principle?
Minimizing the trusted computing base, or TCB.
Okay, what's the TCB?
The TCB is the sum total of all the hardware, firmware, and software components within a system that are absolutely essential for enforcing the security policy, everything that security depends on.
So not the entire operating system, maybe just the kernel's access control parts, the secure boot mechanism.
Exactly. Think of it like that bank vault again. The TCB is the lock, the door, the hinges. It's not the fancy carpet inside or the paint color. The principle is simple. Any failure, any bug, anywhere within the TCB potentially compromises the entire system's security.
So keep it as small and simple as possible.
As small, simple, and rigorously verified as possible. Every line of code, every component you can remove from the TCB without breaking the security policy reduces your attack surface and makes the system easier to analyze and trust.
When it comes to actually developing secure software, the sources emphasize that just ticking boxes on a checklist isn't enough. You need real expertise.
Oh, completely.
Oh.
Security auditing isn't an administrative task you can automate easily. It requires skilled analysts who understand attacker mindsets, who can think adversarially about the design.
And they need clear requirements, right? What is the system actually supposed to protect, and what risks are acceptable?
That's critical. Developers and auditors need complete, unambiguous, well-documented security requirements agreed upon by management. This documentation defines the scope, the assets, the threats, and crucially, the level of acceptable risk.
Why is documenting acceptable risks so important?
Because otherwise, you get conflict and wasted effort. Imagine an analyst finds that, say, internal database traffic isn't encrypted. They might flag it as a critical vulnerability based on general best practice.
Seems reasonable.
But what if management, after careful consideration, decided that the cost and performance impact of encrypting that internal traffic outweighed the risk? Because that database is isolated on a secure network segment protected by firewalls, and they documented this decision.
Then the analyst flagging it is creating noise about a risk management already accepted.
Exactly. Without clear, documented requirements defining acceptable risk, analysts might chase ghosts. Or worse, they might make assumptions and miss real problems because they assume something is protected when management implicitly decided it wasn't worth protecting that way. Clear requirements prevent clashes and focus effort.
Okay, that brings us to the management challenge. How do leaders, CISOs, actually measure and manage this cyber risk, especially when the data is often fuzzy or incomplete? We see those risk matrices everywhere, red, yellow, green squares.
Yeah, the heat maps. And honestly, they're often worse than useless.
Why so harsh? They seem intuitive.
They seem intuitive, but they fundamentally obscure information. Numerous studies show that forcing experts to translate their nuanced judgments into crude ordinal scales like high, medium, low actually increases error and inconsistency. What does medium likelihood even mean? Once a year, once a decade, it's undefined. And multiplying medium likelihood by high impact gives you what exactly? It's mathematically meaningless.
So, ditch the heat maps. What's the alternative? How do you quantify risk with uncertain data?
You embrace the uncertainty using probabilistic methods. You don't need perfect data. For example, use statistical sampling. If you have 10,000 endpoints, you don't need to audit every single one to estimate your vulnerability posture. A well-chosen random sample can give you a surprisingly accurate inference about the whole population, complete with confidence intervals.
And you mentioned the outside view.
Yes. This is crucial. Don't treat every situation inside your organization as completely unique. Look at base rates. What happens to similar organizations? If you're assessing the risk of a major data breach for your retail company, don't start from zero. Look at industry statistics. How often do retailers of your size suffer breaches? That external data, the outside view, provides a much more objective starting point than purely internal subjective guesses. Think like an actuary.
That actuarial mindset leads to a big organizational question. Where should the cybersecurity risk function actually report? Should the CISO work for the CIO or CTO?
Ideally, no. Absolutely not, in my opinion.
Why not? Seems common.
It's a fundamental conflict of interest. The CIO and CTO are primarily responsible for building, deploying, and running the IT systems. Their incentives often lean towards speed, features, innovation.
While the CISO's job is to identify risks in those very systems?
Precisely. The cybersecurity risk management function, the CISO role, should operate independently at the C-suite level, reporting directly to the CEO or maybe the board's risk committee. Their job is to be the objective assessor of digital risk, quantifying likelihood and potential impact in business terms, like dollars lost or operational downtime.
Putting them under the CIO is like...
It's the classic fox guarding the henhouse.
Yeah.
If the person responsible for finding risks reports to the person potentially creating those risks through system deployment choices, the independence and objectivity of risk assessment can be seriously compromised. You need that separation for effective governance.
Okay, so wrapping this all up, this deep dive really drives home that our biggest immediate threat isn't necessarily some future quantum computer breaking RSA next week.
No, probably not next week.
The real borrowed time we're living on comes from the flaws right here, right now. The vulnerabilities in the code we write, the shortcuts in design, the gaps in our risk management.
That's where the active exploitation is happening constantly. The mathematical foundations are strong, but they're sitting on top of layers of potentially fragile implementation.
It demands constant vigilance across the board: math, protocols, code, process, management.
You need that integrated approach. Secure math, secure protocols, secure implementation, and objective risk management. It all has to work together.
And this whole situation, the fragility of our digital systems, combined with the known capabilities of sophisticated state-level attackers, leads us to a pretty profound final thought for you, our listener.
Hmm.
We rely on cryptography, fundamentally, to protect basic rights, like privacy, which is essential for things like free speech and dissent in a healthy democracy. We also know that pervasive mass surveillance can have a chilling effect, potentially hindering social progress, because sometimes laws need to be challenged or bent before they can be changed. Think civil rights movements, for example.
Right. Progress often happens in those gray areas, initially outside the strict letter of the law. That requires some space for private organization and communication.
So, if we accept that premise, that perfect, inescapable enforcement of all rules via surveillance might stifle necessary social change, and we also now know that advanced cyber exploitation allows powerful actors to potentially gain undetectable access into almost any system, bypassing even strong encryption through implementation flaws.
Where does that leave us?
It raises a really difficult question. How does the knowledge of this widespread, sophisticated, potentially undetectable cyber exploitation capability fundamentally alter the future of dissent, investigative journalism, political opposition, and ultimately social change itself, especially in democracies? If there are effectively no truly private digital spaces left for organizing against powerful interests, what does that mean for the evolution of society?
It's a heavy question. What does progress look like when the foundations of private digital life feel so potentially compromised? Something to definitely mull over.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the real-world vulnerabilities behind the digital curtain. We hope it gave you a clearer picture of the challenges.
Thanks for listening.
We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.